When things go wrong and will not come right, though you do the best you can. When life looks black as the hour of night, a pint of plain is your only man. Donal Fallon, welcome to the North Side.
Good to be here. Good to be here.
You're joining me here in the early hours of a Friday morning here in Malloy's on Talbot Street.
Just around the corner from where the man who wrote those immortal words claimed to work for a living. Brian O'Neill, the civil servant who was meant to be in the Custom House, but was normally somewhere like this instead.
Tell me about the importance and the origins of the early house in Dublin, which Malloy's is.
Technically speaking, 3 of these pubs left in Dublin today. That's not a lot, but in one way it's surprising there's even 3 of them. Like in London, for example, there are fewer early houses left than there are in this city. If anyone's wondering where they are, if you want to do a pub crawl, the Porrick Pierce on Pierce Street, the Windjammer, which is pretty much halfway between the Porrick Pierce and where we are at the minute, Malloy's on Talbot Street. These pubs tended to be located either around the fruit and vegetable markets, which makes sense. If you went down to the fruit and veg market in Smithfield, the day for some people was kind of wrapping up around 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, or they tended to be near the docks. So there was a logical topography to where early houses were. I can hear listeners shouting, what about the Boar's Head? What about Slattery's? Those pubs open now at, I think, 9, half 9, 10 o'clock in the morning. And sure, by then the day is gone, you know? What's the point?
Yeah.
7 o'clock, you would be amazed to walk into a pub like Malloy's, the Porrick Pierce, the Windjammer, the variety of people that you meet inside of them. And they're a reminder that there are still people who work nights. There are still people on a different time zone, if you will, even in this little city from the rest of us. I think of the early houses that are gone, Ned's on Townsend Street, replaced by a hotel, the Clada in the market, which is now a cocktail bar. But they were, once upon a time, there were more than 40 of them in Dublin. So this is a dying breed. And really, it's a quite unique experience, isn't it? Having a pint in the AM feels a little bit seditious, actually.
Your book, The Dublin Pub, A Social and Cultural History. You say it's a love letter to the institution that is the public house. Where did your love begin?
My parents courted in pubs. They were children of the ballad boom era. They would have been involved in the Phoenix Folk Club in Ballyfermot, which was in Downey's pub, a great pub. They would have been around the O'Donoghue's scene then and in Merrion Row. And for them as young people, when all that was taking off, I mean, the Dubliners were the pop music of the day. You know, this was a cultural phenomenon. Pubs are where you went to hear music. For me, growing up, I think there's all kinds of reasons I fell in love with pubs. One of them, my father would bring me down to watch St. Patrick's Athletic as a kid in the late 90s, the glory days. We had that great result against Celtic. We bet Celtic 0-0 in Parkhead. And we were inspired to get down and watch our local football club. I remember the towering figure of Con Houlihan standing on the Camac, and my father telling me that's a very important man. And then in the years to come, I would see him around the city in public houses, and there was kind of an interest for me. And literary men like this are drawn to this space. Why? So I think you can't understand any urban environment. You can't write a book about Paris that doesn't feature the cafes. And you can't understand Dublin without having a sense of the public house. You could write a great book called The Irish Pub. Now, I don't drive. And I remember telling my wife, a civil servant, not like Brian O'Neill, a civil servant who's at her desk every day. I remember telling her, I want to write a book about Irish pubs. We'll go from Pater O'Donnell's up in Derry all the way down to Tom Crean's place in Kerry. And she said, there's one problem, Donal, you don't drive.
Yeah, I'm
not ferrying you around the country.
Now, so Eamon Ryan's local buses might be able to help you out in that regard. Like, you know, to do
so the focus...
the pub crawl of Ireland via Eamon Ryan's local bus.
So the focus narrowed. And what I didn't want to do was write a guidebook to Dublin pubs, because I don't find that particularly interesting. I wanted to take a kind of broad historical look at the pub. I suppose it's as much sociology as it is history. And to look at things like music in the pub, the early houses, women in the pub, all of these different, I suppose, social dimensions of what the pub means to us, because the pub's in trouble. Like, we've lost a quarter of our pubs in this country in the last 20 years. And in Dublin City, you wouldn't necessarily feel that, but I would tell every Dubliner, you know, drive through a bypassed village and look at the lay of the land. I mean, there's a town like Neenah, where the Hibernian closed the other day. You couldn't do 12 pubs at Christmas in Neenah now, because there aren't 12 pubs to go to. And that's not the way it would have been 20 years ago. So across the country, we're seeing an extraordinary decline in pubs. In Dublin, it's much more in the suburbs you're seeing that. A pub like the Silver Granite in Palmerstown, enormous pub. The super pubs of the 50s and the 60s when suburbia was growing. Everything about that pub should make sense economically. It's right beside a cemetery. It's for the afters, all that kind of stuff. It's being levelled for apartments. So in the suburbs of Dublin, pubs are closing at an extraordinary rate. And I felt like I was trying to capture a moment in time and a moment in crisis in some ways for the great Irish third space.
You have spoken as well about the role that particular pubs played within society. You picked one pub where you said this was about the democracy of the pub. Explain that to me.
I mean, I like the democracy of a pub where there are no VIPs.
Yeah, you were talking about the Chancery Inn in
early
Enniskeane.
houses. I remember the Chancery Inn on the Quays, which is no longer there.
Yeah.
But the Chancery was right beside the forecourts. And I recall walking into the Chancery. Now, this was not the early morning for me. This was the end of a late night. And looking at the crowd there as a 19, 20-year-old and seeing people who were sculling pints in fear, because this could be the worst day of their life, and they could be destined to spend a few years somewhere where they didn't want to be. People that were on the other side of the courtroom, so to speak, market workers, young ravers whose night was coming to an end. Everyone was there in this shared space. I found that quite extraordinary. I also love a pub like Grogan's, where the death of Tommy Smith, the proprietor of Grogan's, in 2020 was one of the factors that encouraged me to write this book. That's a pub that appears on all these lists and TripAdvisors and Rick Steves guidebooks and everything else. But you can't reserve tables there. Everyone is equal in that place. And I think that's what's very special about the pub. Be you Bono or be you what Miles Digopouline would call one of the plain people of Ireland. Within a space like the pub, there is a democracy, isn't there? Where we're all equal until we're banned.
What about the history of pubs? And as a result, you do pick locations like the Gravediggers in Glasnevin. What is it about that place that you love?
Well, I'm very hostile to, and I use the word culture here in a very loose sense, influencer culture. And anyone who looks on Instagram will see this all the time. There's a real veneration of a handful of pubs. And there's an obsession with what's the best? What's the best pint? What's the best pub? What's the best snug? I wanted to pull out from that and to try and look at the industry in a broader sense. The Gravediggers is one of those pubs that always features on those lists. And yet, despite that, it maintains that rule we talked about it being a very democratic space. It's a very important pub, literally in the life of people who work in Glasnevin Cemetery, a place of death, but also a place of life. Many people work in Prospect Cemetery, and that long connection between Prospect Cemetery and that public house in particular was something I wanted to explore. But while the Gravediggers will be an internationally renowned pub, I'm very grateful to Ciarán Kavanagh because he pulled out the guidebook. And we have a picture in the book of Anthony Bourdain's entry into the guidebook of the Gravediggers. Take a pub like the Wren's Nest in the Strawberry Beds. It has 2 reviews on TripAdvisor. It's one of the most extraordinary public houses I've ever been in, and only 2 people have ever reviewed it, which to me is just amazing. And despite the fact it's right there by the Phoenix Park, it feels like you're very deep in rural Ireland when you're in the Wren's Nest. It's a former house. Often, it's all in the name, isn't it? Public house. In the Victorian age, what were private living quarters were converted into public places of drinking. The Wren's Nest is an example of something that hides in plain sight. It's 25-30 minutes from the centre of Dublin. It's on the front of that great Dubliners LP, At Home with the Dubliners. There's traditional music playing in the bars, and yet most people have never been there. So
don't even know it's there.
Exactly. Yeah. So for me, it was as important that somewhere like Malloy's on Talbot Street or the Wren's Nest in the Strawberry Beds get its place in there, not just the Gravediggers and Grogan's and the institutions that people are more familiar with. When it comes to the more famous pubs, I wanted to find the more unusual stories. So if you take somewhere like Grogan's, Tommy Smith was a great champion of the arts, and one of the things he did in his pub, which I think is very, very admirable, was he introduced art onto the walls of the public house with 0 commission charged by the establishment. It's the only gallery in the world, actually, where the art gets better the more you drink. I've found that a painting of no appeal at 9 p.m. can be something you want to take home with you by midnight. But in a city where galleries can charge as much as 50%, 60% commission, there was something very democratic about that. Coming back to that word, and Tommy had a sense that artists are drinking in my pub, so I'm benefiting from their presence. How can they benefit from us being
added
here
to the character of the pub as well? I mean, the fact that there is actual art for sale on the wall that you can walk away with.
And I discovered stories I never knew. For example, Kevin Monaghan, who was a contemporary of J.P. Dunleavy, an American GI from the Second World War, who arrived in Dublin after the war. The GI Bill was basically designed to keep some Americans in Europe. Didn't want all these mad men coming back home at the same time. And many of them studied in Trinity College. J.P. Dunleavy, the ginger man. This guy, Kevin Monaghan, drank between Grogan's and the Dawson Lounge. And every year his friends would take a portrait of Kevin, and on a horse and carriage they would deliver it from one pub to the other and march behind it in procession.
Brilliant.
So he was gone, but he lived on in that little way, that little act of commemoration. So pubs have these little rituals about them that we might not know about if we're not regulars of those establishments, but they're very nice things. I wanted to champion pubs in parts of the city that are struggling. For example, we hear Marlborough Street, even Talbot Street, and there is a perception of this street and the streets around it in the press. Somewhere like Piper's Corner, where Sean Potts has created what I think is arguably the most important traditional music pub in the city since the Cobblestone took off. A place where there's traditional music most nights of the week. Sean McKeown, Damien Dempsey's uilleann piper, an extraordinary musician. You can walk into somewhere like Piper's Corner and hear a musician of that calibre playing on a Wednesday night or a Thursday night. And I feel that pubs that do well and create community and bring people into the city, that's one of the things that is lifting the centre of Dublin.
If we go down to Temple Bar tonight, and let's face it, we won't be, you'll see a lot of influencers splitting the G on the pint of Guinness and so on over on stag and hen parties and all that.
I like to refer to the British influencers splitting the G as ginsels. I don't know where this came from. I never remember this culture.
It's become a thing, though.
Yeah.
But your point is, though, that in the midst of all that tourist trappery that is Temple Bar, there is one shining gem of a pub that still remains strong to its traditions, and that's the Palace Bar.
It's an intergenerationally owned pub, and I was amazed in the research how many pubs in the city are intergenerational in terms of ownership. So the Palace, you take Willie Ahern, his father Liam, his grandfather Bill, all stirring that one ship in an area that's changed, let's be honest, very, very dramatically. When you walk into the Palace, a couple of things strike you about it. The first thing on the wall is the Tipperary Association plaque. So this family have been in Dublin for generations, and yet people still call the Palace a Tipperary pub. I haven't been able to get to the bottom of this phenomenon, and maybe a listener can help me with this. Why are there so many Tipperary-owned pubs in Dublin? I mean, by far, the largest number of publicans come from that great, proud county. But the Aherns have changed very little.
Sean Ryan is only around the corner here. Yeah.
One thing I love about the Palace, they have televisions, but they know when to use them. They're very rarely turned on. And there's something special about that. A defining memory for me of being maybe 20, 21, going into the Palace and seeing the unmistakable form of Seamus Heaney with his good friend Seamus Dean. They were there on occasion. But one day Heaney was reading a newspaper on his own, and I just made the point, I'm going to talk to Seamus Heaney. And for maybe 10 minutes we chatted about another poet, Michael Hartnett, in the back of the Palace. I don't think there's another city in the world where, going back to the democracy of the public house, the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature is talking to a 21-year-old curious reader for a couple of minutes in the Palace. But it's a place where people go with newspapers. Sometimes having a pint with a friend is fantastic. Sometimes the solitary pint over a newspaper is the best thing in the world. And the Palace seems to be one of those places.
And if you can get the snug in the Palace, all the better. If you get your timing just right.
The snug in there is a shrine to former regulars. One of Con Houlihan's great columns is there. Everyone has a favourite Con Houlihan column. I mean, everyone knows the Paddy Cullen one. When Paddy died, Con was trending on Google searches with Paddy. He followed him around forever, running back to his goal like a woman who smelled a cake burning in the oven. I always loved his line about Pats. He said, the good people of Inchicore have followed St. Pat's through tin and tinner. But some of Con's columns are there in the snug, and a lovely image by a photographer called Lee Miller. And if people know her name, it's because Kate Winslet played her in a fantastic biopic last year. Lee Miller comes to Dublin in 1946. She's sent by Vogue to photograph James Joyce's Dublin. She's just had a very rough time of it. She's been photographing the Second World War. She was at the liberation of several concentration camps. And now she's in the Palace Bar. And she's a lovely line in her diary. She says, in the sacred men's only bar, I stood at the partition between bar and lounge and took those images. And one of her pictures is hanging in is hanging in the snug of the Palace. There's no greater act of commemoration to a former customer than hanging their image in the pub. And for me, it leaves a bad taste when ownership often changes some pubs. And when they take down, whatever about changing the decor, the wallpaper, painting the walls, the image of a regular that's been on the wall for 20, 30 years, that means so much to the community, to their family, whatever it might be. So they're like little they're spaces of collective memory, and sometimes they're local museums in terms of what they display.
Because they represent the community, and the community is the people who frequented them and also lived in that area. Now, this is about the Dublin pub, and I'm going to take you out of Dublin for a moment, because you do have a few favourites around the country, despite not driving. You have a particular pub that you single out in Cork.
I think Cork is a city of tremendous pubs, and I'm nominally a Beamish drinker. I remember in my days as a lounge boy in the Parmesan House, Beamish was known as a pint of social welfare, I think. But it's had a revival. You can even get a pint of Beamish in Gibney's in London now. But
it was always cheaper than the other pint of stout.
Always a little bit cheaper. But for me in Cork, I love Mutton Lane. I love how it's attached to the markets, and it's part of the life of the markets. And like a pub like this, which was beside the docks, or a pub like the Chancery beside the markets, the English market in Cork and Mutton Lane are inseparable from each other. I love the Oval. I just think the architectural beauty of the Oval. It's a classic Victorian interior. And George Orwell had...
And across the road from Beamish and Crawford, it was built by Beamish and Crawford. Yeah.
George Orwell had a description of what the perfect pub is, right down to the tobacco-stained ceilings and the mahogany partitions and everything else. The advertising mirrors, that's the Oval.
Yeah.
If you read Orwell's description of what a perfect pub is and you walk into the Oval in Cork, the front bar of Malloy's is similar. I mean, there's advertising mirrors in this pub for distilleries that no longer exist. They're a real 19th century phenomenon, 19th century commercial Dublin history. But in Cork, for me, the Oval just feels very special. The High B. The
High B we cannot not mention if you're talking about Cork.
It'd be a crime. And what a character he was.
Yeah, Brian O'Connell died 6-7 years ago.
I will never forget going in there with a friend, ordering 2 pints of Beamish, sitting down. About 20 minutes later, the friend looks at me and says, "Something's gone wrong here." I went up and said, 2 pints of Beamish, please. He arrived down with 4 pints and he said, "I heard you the first time, lads." Yeah. I mean, that's a good barman, isn't it? No phones in the High B.
You were lucky that Brian didn't bar you for your impertinence with that behaviour. But great city for that kind of attitude. Take me back to Dublin then. MacDaid's is another one that features. Why?
Yeah, MacDaid's is an interesting pub. It was I always consider, I see the Palace and MacDaid's as pubs that were more or less similar but very different. They were both literary pubs, but MacDaid's, I would argue the Palace was kind of an editor's pub. You know, if you wanted to meet R.M. Smiley, who would famously cycle to work with his typewriter on the handlebars of the bicycle, he'd be in the back bar of the Palace. MacDaid's attracted a more kind of bohemian, younger writer set. So the lore is that on one occasion, Smiley said, "I'm going to see what MacDaid's is all about." And when he opened the door of the pub, there was Brendan Behan with his shirt open singing, "I was Lady Chatterley's lover." He said, I've seen enough of this." went back to the Palace. MacDaid's for me will always be Patrick Kavanagh. It will always be Tony Cronin, Brendan Behan at a moment in time. Not everyone liked MacDaid's. John McGahern, I think, referred to it as a literary shark tank. And he would call writers, and he didn't mean this in a positive way, he's a MacDaidian writer. You know, it felt to him like a little world of its own that he didn't want to be part of. But MacDaid's and the Palace were at one point the 2 great literary pubs of the city, and they were very much at loggerheads with each other.
You talk a lot in the book as well about the social history, and you believe it is important to set the record straight about the role of women in pubs.
Yeah, I mean, when you're writing a book called The Dublin Pub, people expect the cover of that book to be Brendan Behan stumbling out the door of MacDaid's or something to that effect. I was adamant that we put a woman on the front of the book, because when I went into the National Archives, where they have amazing primary sources on the history of licenses and who were publicans, women have always been at the backbone of running pubs. And the image on the front of the book is a woman called Miss Cooney. She ran the Brazen Head for decades on her own terms. She resisted draft beer till the very end. Much to the annoyance of Arthur Guinness and Sons up the road, she only served bottled beer. And that went on well into the 80s. But I wanted to explore this myth. When did women start drinking in pubs? Some people tell you it was the 1970s or 1980s in the markets area. a very famous pub in Dublin now, the Hacienda, which was once an early house called Corbett's. That was very popular with female traders from the nearby markets, going back into the 20s and the 30s. So I think in working class communities, in pubs around the markets and the docks, it was totally normal to have women in those pubs in the 20s, 30s and 40s. In places like Neary's, McDade's, the Palace, they were very much men's spaces. And that was a battle. I mean, famously, Nell McCafferty would lead women into Neary's, demanding the right to a pint. And that was picked up the next day in the papers. Pint Commandos from the Irish Women's Liberation Movement storm Neary's was the title of the press report on that one. So I think certain pubs were regarded as pubs where men of letters went. Journalists, novelists, editors. But in the markets, in the docks, I think there was a much more democratic attitude towards women in the pub.
When we bring dignitaries to Ireland, they always end up at a pub pulling a pint, be it Obama, the Queen, almost the Duke of Edinburgh and the Queen, but they stood back and didn't quite partake themselves. Is it still an intrinsic part of our national identity, or is that an old Ireland that we're representing there?
There was a time when O'Donoghue's was at the height of its cultural power, and Senator Ted Kennedy arrives to see O'Donoghue's with a convoy of cars sitting outside. I think there's a way we can champion the pub as part of what we are as a society without championing the drink, if that makes sense. That we need to see the pub as a broader space of cultural importance. I think pubs that are doing really well are pubs where, if you walk into the Piper's Corner or the Wren's Nest is quite isolated in the Strawberry Beds. So really a taxi is the way you're going to get there. And if you drive, you have to sacrifice aspects of your night. If you walk into a traditional music session in those pubs, there are often as many pots of tea on the table as there are pints of stout. And when we want, which I think we should be seeking, as the Vintners Federation think we should be seeking, UNESCO status for our pubs. For example, the Uilleann Pipes are recognised by UNESCO as part of the intangible cultural heritage of this little island. If we want that for our pubs, we're not talking about UNESCO status for the pint of stout. We're talking about UNESCO status for the community space that is the public house in the village. And I've seen pubs hosting things like book clubs, pubs that are putting more and more emphasis on food, and that's very divisive, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, some people would argue pubs shouldn't be doing food at all, but pubs are having to adjust to cater to more aspects of people's lives than just the drink. So
going back to their roots of being a part of the community, because the community, to draw the community back in, basically.
Absolutely. One of the problems, I think, for rural pubs is when you have campaigning on their behalf saying we need to lower the VAT rate for pubs across the country. That's true for pubs that are struggling in Kerry and in Galway and in Roscommon. But the press will say, well, that VAT cut will also apply to the Temple Bar in Dublin. There are institutions in Dublin that certainly don't need those kind of support. So I think we might need a very localised support system when it comes to public houses. And in isolated rural villages where post offices are closing, shops are closing because there's now an Aldi in the middle of 5 villages.
Yeah.
So the local corner shop is gone. We need to ask ourselves, how can we support publicans in rural Irish villages to increase what they offer and to become community hubs, community centres? In Britain next door, when the Labour Party were on that amazing housing drive after the Second World War, the 1940s and 50s, Liverpool, Salford, Manchester, they would often build pubs into working class estates because they had a sense that that was an important part of people's lives. And I think we need to think like that now, that in combating loneliness and isolation, we should be supporting publicans in rural Ireland to increase their offering and become that great third space again. Yeah,
because it is strange. I mean, apart from in rural Ireland, they're obviously facing the pressures of declining populations. Obviously drink driving is an important aspect here, and we're not in any way condoning that, but it does limit the ability of people to go to the pub compared to what it was in the 60s and 70s. In urban Ireland, those are now very expensive pieces of real estate, and we have large suburbs in Dublin that no longer have the pub. So suddenly you've got from a 5-minute walk to a 25-minute walk to get to the nearest pub. So what's the future hold then, if we're here in 20 years' time?
If a community is doing well, the pub is doing well. I think a good example of that is, there's a pub in the book that is not a very romanticised pub at all, the Towers in Ballymun. By the end of it, I mean, the Towers was in a bad state. There's a brilliant website, I wish I came up with this name, there's a website called Dying for a Pint. And he chronicles the history of people dying in public houses from the revolutionary period up to gangland violence. But when Ballymun was doing well, the Towers really was the centre of that community. And actually, the Towers pub outlasted the 7 towers from which it took its name. It was remembered as a very important part of its community. You know, in England, they say never drink in a flat roof pub. We think about Phoenix nights and things like that. That pub was doing well in its day. So we need to have a think about why it was doing well at one point and then it wasn't. How do we integrate pubs into communities in a way that they are part of the life of people, be it the Christmas play, be it the men's shed, be it the book club, be it lunch, whatever it might be. I think you'll crack a lot of issues if you can fix that dimension of it.
Donal Fallon, Sláinte, and thanks very much for joining us.